As the Anglo-American War entered its third year, the tide was turning against the United States. Although they had achieved solid successes in the West, the American advances there had now stalled due to lengthening supply lines and stiffening resistance. In the East, things looked very grim indeed. The strategic assumption behind America's declaration of war was that the British would be too preoccupied with their conflict with France to be able to simultaneously prosecute a war across the Atlantic. This was plausible enough in 1812, but by 1814 the Napoleonic Wars were winding down, and the British were beginning to send significant reinforcements to the theatre. The Royal Navy established a blockade of the eastern US seaboard, stifling all trade, and a large army formed up on the northern borders of New York and Vermont. The soldiers in this army were veterans from the Peninsular War, the cream of Britain's armies. The opposing American land forces were inexperienced and outnumbered, and few were hopeful they could repulse an invasion. By September of 1814, the British were on the move. The Americans set up their defences along the Saranac River, which they buttressed with several redoubts around the small town of Plattsburgh. The 3,000-strong civilian population were all evacuated. As always on the remote US-Canadian border, the availability of supply was the main limiting factor on the size and effectiveness of armies. By far the most effective way of moving troops and goods around at the time was by water, so any successful land invasion was dependent on securing control of Lake Champlain. Champlain is a long, narrow stretch of water, not actually a part of the Great Lakes system, which nonetheless serves as the natural trading route between New England and Montreal. It could equally well serve as an invasion route. Naval superiority on this strategically important stretch of water had been hotly contested and swung back and forth throughout the war. Under Captain, later Commodore, Thomas McDonough, the Americans undertook a major building program at the Otter Creek shipyard in Vermont. The British based their operations at the old French fort of Isle-aux-Noix, and by 1814 the opposing squadrons were roughly equal in numbers and firepower. In 1814, wooden sailing ships armed with smoothbore cannon had been the method of fighting at sea for at least 2 centuries. The technology and the tactics were therefore very well known. Both the US Navy and the British Royal Navy were very professional organisations led by highly experienced and capable commanders. They knew exactly what wooden ships could do and what they could not, how to manipulate the wind, and how to manoeuvre to bring the maximum amount of firepower to bear became a simple matter of arithmetic. During the War of 1812 there were many clashes at sea, and in all cases the larger, more powerful ship or squadron won. Nobody managed to win a battle against the odds. War at sea was very determinative. It was hard to spring tactical surprises. There were only a few fights at sea where the two sides were more or less evenly matched, and the Battle of Plattsburgh, sometimes called the Battle of Lake Champlain, was by far the largest and most decisive. The British commander was one Captain George Downey. Downey was a very experienced and competent Scotsman, but only recently been transferred from commanding a ship on Lake Ontario. Ideally, Downey would have liked more time to build up and train his force, but the British Army was pressing him to sweep the Americans from the lake quickly before the weather turned. At dawn of 11th of September 1814, Downey duly led his little fleet south to engage the American squadron. Aware that the Royal Navy ships had a higher proportion of long-range cannons than he did, MacDonough anchored his force in a defensive line just inside Plattsburgh Bay, which meant that an attacking force would be forced to fight at medium and short ranges. MacDonough also prepared special kedge anchors, which would enable his ships to make an emergency 180-degree turn and present an undamaged side to an attacker. At the head of the American line was the USS Eagle. Eagle was a brig sloop, which meant she was a 2-masted vessel with the traditional square, actually trapezoidal, sails. She had been very hurriedly constructed, only 31 days, which is Liberty ship speeds for a wooden vessel. So swift had she been brought about that her captain originally called her the USS Surprise, but the authorities disapproved and insisted on the more patriotic name of Eagle. Next in line was a squadron flagship, the USS Saratoga. Saratoga was variously described as a corvette or a light frigate, but the distinctions are largely semantic. She was basically a cut-down mini seagoing warship with 3 masts and square, trapezoidal sails. Still, at 143 feet long and nearly 750 tons displacement, she was the largest and most powerful vessel of the US squadron. Next in line was the USS Ticonderoga. Designed as a civilian steamship, Ticonderoga was about half finished when the US Navy purchased and completed her as a schooner, a 2-masted vessel with fore and aft sails. This was probably done because of her narrow beam, because at 120 feet long and 375 tons displacement, Ticonderoga was a very big schooner indeed. Her rigging fit is uncertain. The only semi-reliable picture of her under construction shows a vessel with 2 equally sized masts but no spars. It is almost certain she was gaff-rigged, but whether she had spirit sails, as depicted here, is uncertain. Perhaps spars and topsails were added after the drawing was made. This configuration is correct, but it may not be accurate. The last major vessel in the US squadron was the USS Preble. Preble was a sloop, a small single-masted vessel with fore and aft sails. The problem with depicting Preble is that although her crew and armament and even her displacement is known, her exact dimensions are not. Given her armament, she must have been bigger than sloops of similar displacement on the Great Lakes, and the only way that can be is if she had a flatter bottom and therefore a shallower draft. This makes sense, as Champlain is shallower than any of the Great Lakes. These 4 comprised the main fighting strength of the American squadron. All of them had a mixed armament of long guns and carronades. The balance of the US force was made up of rowing galleys, not sailing ships but boats with removable masts and basic sails, but which used oars to propel themselves in battle. Not very seaworthy, rowing galleys were mostly used to put a few extra cannon onto the water. They were generally rarely used outside home ports or coastal areas, except on shallow, sheltered Lake Champlain. Most commentators are very dismissive of the rowing galleys, but they had to have been quite substantial vessels, or they would not have been able to support the weight of the heavy cannon they were armed with. The larger examples displaced 65 to 70 tons and had a crew of over 40, which is not much smaller than the sloops in the battle. Leading the British squadron was HMS Confiance, easily the biggest warship in the battle that day. In fact, at nearly 150 feet long and 1,200 tons displacement, she's the largest warship ever to have sailed on Lake Champlain and probably made up at more than half of the British fighting power. Confiance was a proper 5th-rate frigate with 3 masts and trapezoidal sails. She was not a particularly well-made vessel. In fact, there were still carpenters on board finishing her as she sailed into battle. Confiance's exact configuration is uncertain. There is some discrepancy among sources as to her exact armament, but it was somewhere between 24 and 30 24-pound long guns, and probably a few large carronades as well. Given her known dimensions, and even the largest estimate of her armament, she probably had only a single full gun deck and partial second one at prow and quarterdeck. The large flag is accurate though, a massive 25-foot x 15-foot ensign. It is now on display at the US Naval Academy at Annapolis. On Confiance's starboard side was HMS Linnet. Like the USS Eagle, Linnet was a brig sloop, 2-masted with trapezoidal sails, but she was much smaller than the American vessel. She was much shorter, but about the same beam. This has advantages and disadvantages. Narrower vessels are intrinsically faster and more manoeuvrable, because they have less surface area pushing against the water, but broader beam ships are more stable gun platforms, and they can operate in shallower water. Most sources claim she had 16 12-pounder long guns, but some say they were 18-pounders. The last 2 large British vessels were the sloops Chubb and Finch. Warships at this time typically had hulls painted black, with yellow streaking if British or white if American. Chubb and Finch here are depicted in black and white, and the reason is that they were American ships captured earlier in the war and pressed into Royal Navy service. In making these models, I've assumed that the British had neither the time, materials nor inclination to repaint them. As with the American sloop, the exact dimensions and rigging of these 2 vessels has had to be estimated. It is known, given their armament and displacement, that they were both slightly larger than USS Preble. The remainder of the British squadron was the same melange of rowing galleys that the Americans used. The British have slightly more, 12 rather than 10, but the American ones are slightly larger on average. All told, the British squadron came to 16 vessels, totalling 2,300 tons displacement. They had approximately 90 cannon, throwing 1,000 pounds of shot from long guns and about 850 from carronades. The US squadron had 14 vessels, weighing in at 2,200 tons displacement. They had about 80 cannon, throwing 720 pounds of shot from long guns, with over 1,200 from carronades. In addition, the Americans had the support of improvised shore batteries operated by the US Army. These were mostly concentrated around the village of Plattsburgh itself, and were too far away from the main action to have had much effect. The most significant was located to the south on Crab Island, where the Americans established a hospital. Manned by invalids, it consisted of a single 6-pounder long gun. The British plan was to match the larger Saratoga and Eagle with Confiance and Chubb, and work around their northern flank with the shallow-drafted Linnet. Meanwhile, the Finch would mass the Preble, the British rowing galleys would mass, fire a single salvo at Ticonderoga, and then move in and board her. The Americans, who didn't actually have to beat the British, just to avoid getting beaten themselves, simply planned to sit tight. With squadrons this equal in strength, it only needed small successive flukes of chance or inspired decisions to gradually build to a decisive decision. The first of these went to the Americans. As the British squadron rounded Flamborough Head and moved to engage, the wind suddenly dropped and veered, slowing their advance and exposing them to American fire for longer. As a result of this, they were forced to turn into a line of battle at a greater distance than they would have liked. The second twist of fortune came in favour of the British. Confiance had been exposed to a galling fire from several American ships as she closed. Downey held his fire until he could face opposite Saratoga, and then unleashed a devastating single opening broadside that killed or wounded 1/5 of the crew on the American flagship. MacDonough moved quickly to rally Saratoga's stunned sailors, and in so doing achieved the third twist of fate. One shot from Saratoga's return salvo hit one of Confiance's 24-pounders and rammed it back into Captain Downey, who had been helping to sight the gun, killing him instantly. The cannon, complete with dint where it had been hit, is still on display at the US Naval Academy at Annapolis. The fourth turn of fate occurred on the southern flank. As Finch moved to engage the Preble, Ticonderoga swung using her kedge anchors and fired a broadside which fortuitously knocked down all of the British sloops' rigging. With no motive power, Finch drifted onto Crab Island, where unable to defend herself from the battery there, she surrendered. Ticonderoga then swung back and drove off the British rowing galleys, moving to board her. At the northern end of the line, Chubb was badly damaged by Eagle and drifted into the American line, where she surrendered. Linnet succeeded in reaching round the northern flank of the American line and began to rake the Eagle. Unable to turn to meet the attack, the commander of the Eagle cut his anchors and drifted southwards, re-anchoring to the south of Saratoga and joining the fight against Confiance. Unfortunately, this exposed the American flagship to Linnet's raking fire, and combined with fire from Confiance, soon all of Saratoga's starboard guns were out of action. It was at this point that MacDonough hauled in the kedge anchors he had laid out earlier and spun Saratoga around so that her undamaged port battery could be brought into action. Confiance attempted to haul in on her springs to make a similar manoeuvre, but she was much slower, and with many of her anchors already shot away, she only succeeded in presenting her vulnerable stern to the American vessels. Raked and unable to properly return fire, Confiance was compelled to surrender. Linnet bravely fought on for another 20 minutes, but it was now clearly hopeless. Exposed to Saratoga's fresh broadside, she too eventually hauled down her colours. The British galleys retired, mostly unmolested, and apparently some of them subsequently deserted to the Americans. Apart from the loss of ships, British casualties amounted to 200 killed or wounded, and over 500 more captured or deserted. Total American casualties came to 100 killed and slightly more wounded, the majority being on the Saratoga. Defeat meant the British were being able to supply their land army, and they were therefore forced to cancel their invasion. New England was saved.